I could, I would teach you all the things I never learned, and I'd help you cross the bridges that I burned. Yes, I would.
Coming in as you saw these images. That song was by the great, she self-proclaimed song stylist, Nancy Wilson. And as I finished reading Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me, the emotion that came to me after I finished reading that text was, for me, captured in that song by Nancy Wilson. And it's a song that I heard many times as a child from my father, who is now deceased, who loved Nancy Wilson. And it was a particular emotion that I had because my father passed away in the same year that one young man passed away who is on the screen this afternoon. And so Ta-Nehisi Coates starts this book very early on by staking out the ground and giving you the names of people. Renisha McBride, Eric Garner, John Crawford, Tamir Rice, Marlene Pinnock, Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, and this young man right here, Prince Carmen Jones. He spends a lot of time talking about Prince Jones in this text. Spends a lot of time talking about Howard University. And Prince Jones, like all of you in here, was a Howard University student. Prince Jones was in his car, in his own car that his mother bought for him, driving from PG County to visit his fiancée in Fairfax, Virginia, Fairfax County, Virginia, followed by a plainclothes police officer in a case of mistaken identity. This brother pulls in a driveway trying to evade that police officer, not knowing what fate would hold, not knowing who was following him. He's one block from his fiance's house. He pulls into a driveway at night, and the cop stops and empties 16 rounds into his car. And he's hit in the back 5 times, and he dies. The title of this talk with you all this afternoon is Abandonment and Dismemberment, Something Torn and New. And all of these images up here are aspects of that dismemberment. Dismembering what Ta-Nehisi Coates would call the dismemberment of the black body in America. And how do we explain that dismemberment? And really, in laying out the ground of these names very early on, he's trying to give us all a way to understand that, a way that he attempts to explain and understand that. So Ta-Nehisi Coates in this book says that, well, in order to understand all of those faces that you see and many more, you have to understand race and racism in this country and how it operates. And so he says very early on in this text, but race is not the child of racism, but race is the child of racism, not the father. And the process of naming the people has never been a matter of genealogy and physiognomy so much as one of hierarchy. These new people are, like us, a modern invention. But unlike us, their new name has no real meaning, divorced from the machinery of criminal power. Race is a child of racism. Well, if it's the child of racism, then what is racism and where does it come from? And how do you explain that? There are a lot of different ways that you can explain it. You can explain racism as irrational individual or group acts of meanness. You can explain the origins of racism in the encounter that Africans had with Europeans in the slave trade and its aftermath. Or you can try to go a little deeper. And this book by Cedric Robinson, Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition, this book urges us to go a little bit deeper in how we explain the origins of racism. And so Robinson takes the position in this text that racism begins in the bowels of Western civilization. And that idea intensifies in the encounter that Africa and African people have with Europe post 15th century onwards. The use of African labor to fuel an idea of racial capitalism. The idea, the thing that actually grounds and founds the wealth and the power that you see being displayed today by Western European nations and the United States. So, what Ta-Nehisi Coates is trying to get us to see in this text is that when you look at vignettes of police brutality, it's a fundamental mistake to divorce and to separate those acts of police brutality from the ideologies and structures that produce them. In fact, police brutality is too convenient an explanation for what's going on. Ta-Nehisi Coates is trying to get us to look at something deeper, the deeper idea to explain police brutality. And that idea is that racism is embedded in the institutions and ideologies of this country. Those are the things that police black lives in this country. The racism in the epistemologies, knowledge production, those are the things that police black lives in this country. Racism in terms of the systems of governance and laws, those are the things that police black lives in this country. As Ta-Nehisi Coates would say, the dreamers and the ideological use of the dream. The thing that is used to control the black body under sweet sounding words. So when we look at what's happening here, you have to understand how it manifests, not just on a historical level, but also how it manifests in the present. And this is a slide that shows Ronald Walters. And Ronald Walters, if you want to understand and get a sense of the background of how racism manifests in the present, go read this text. Ronald Walters spent 25 years of his academic career at Howard University. We have a Ronald Walters Center. He was a professor and chair of political science here at Howard University for many years. Ronald Walters is one of the most revered and respected black political scientists that we have ever produced in this country. One of the texts that Ronald Walters wrote was White Nationalism and Black Interests. And this text gives you a very, very nice background on having a broader view of what we see going on today. Whether we talk about education, whether we talk about the attack on the black poor, whether we talk about the deregulation of civil rights, it doesn't matter the issue. But Ronald Walters is saying that the historical animation of racism deals with how a white majority sees itself and all of the means that that white majority attempts to utilize to maintain its control over the state. The policies that it produces, the politics that are involved, and all of the issues. That race and racism is an underlying current that is ever present. And both liberals and conservatives make a fundamental mistake. The mistake that they make is that they frame racism as this minor problem in an otherwise healthy democratic republic. And Ronald Walters and Cedric Robinson and Ta-Nehisi Coates are pushing back against that notion. They are saying that racism is just not a minor problem, that racism itself is the animating idea that shapes and gives energy to this republic since its inception. And if you don't understand how that idea manifests and continues over time, then you understand little of what's going on with the faces that we started this presentation off with. So, Ta-Nehisi Coates' name communicates something, communicates a beginning conversation. And the process of naming is very important because naming gives you the authority to control your own interpretation of yourself and your own humanity on a social level, on a historical level, and on a cultural level. Ta-Nehisi's name is an ancient Egyptian name. His name is given to him by his father, who I'll say more about in a few minutes, Paul Coates. But when you have a name like that, that name immediately communicates a certain idea. And his name means the land of the Nehesi, or the land of the Nubians. And what does that specifically refer to? Well, we can take a little text out of the Temple of Deir el-Bahari in Upper Egypt by a beautiful sister pharaoh, Hatshepsut, around 1500 BC. Inside her temple, she has what they call them the punt reliefs. And ancient Egypt, these punt reliefs, Hatshepsut sponsored an expedition from Egypt all the way down the Nile, using the Red Sea, all the way to modern Eritrea and modern Somalia, which is what they call the land of Punt. In this text, they give three names together. They give Punt, they give what is called Cush, which is situated around the third cataract and a little bit below, and then they give Ta-Nehesi in this text. And Ta-Nehesi refers to the other Africans to the south of Egypt, below the third cataract, somewhere below what's called the Dongola Reach. So the name that Ta-Nehesi was given by his father urges him to give respect and reverence to not just an early African civilization, but it's also an affirmation right up front of African humanity. And so when you're given a name like that, you have to say something about the person that produced him. Ta-Nehisi Coates talks reverently about both his father and his mother in a book called The Beautiful Struggle, more so than he does in this particular text. But his father, Paul Coates, is a major figure. His father was a member of the Black Panther Party. And if you read the news this morning, Ta-Nehisi Coates is now going to have a comic book that he's doing named The Black Panther. Shout out to his father. But Paul Coates is educated in Atlanta University, took his master's in Atlanta University, library science, came back here to Howard University and worked in Moreland Spingarn, in that library, reading everything. In 1978, Paul Coates starts what's called the Black Classic Press, originally a desktop publishing company that became a big-time publishing company. What Paul Coates' idea was to have respect and reverence. He saw his library as a temple. He had respect and reverence for Black writers that attempted to keep the flicker of African humanity alive by writing stories, by telling the history, discussing the culture of African people. And in his mind, he has the idea that I never want these things to die. Because if they die, a part of our humanity dies in the process. So he has spent his whole life keeping these texts alive, surrounding his children with the rhythms of Africa. So this instruction from a father to his son, Ta-Nehesi Coates, had a deep impact on this young man's life of being surrounded by that on a daily basis. And so he recounts this. And so as Ta-Nehesi Coates' father, what his father did for him, now he is trying to do likewise to his son. So he frames this text as a communication, as a letter to his son. But that literary motif is not original. That literary motif has ancient African roots. The literary motif itself of a communication or an instruction of a father to his son, the origins of that lie in ancient Egypt also. And the earliest manifestation of that literary motif is in a text called The Instructions of Ptah-hotep, the earliest full-length wisdom text in world history, conservatively dated to around 2400 BC. A very old text. And in this text of the Instructions of Ptah-hotep, is part of a larger genre called a Sebaït, or a wisdom instruction. And what a wisdom instruction is, this is my definition: something that communicates the systematic and intentional intergenerational transmission of oral and written knowledge and wisdom, moral ideas and values, and practical advice of the culture's worldview on how to optimally live a moral, socially engaged, and meaningful life. That's a wisdom instruction, and there are many wisdom instructions. And this is the type of instruction that Ta-Nehesi Coates is trying to give, not just his son, because Ptah-hotep, like Ta-Nehesi Coates' book, is that it transcends the personal level. It transcends the personal, and then it becomes a national text, a national lesson for all of the nation to know. That's the Sebaït at its best. So, in Egyptian hieroglyphs, early on in that text, it shows you what a Sebaït is. And it says, Ikjedi nf medu sejimiu. Then I will teach him the speech of those who heard. Sejimiu, those who heard. Those who heard what? Those who heard Sekeru imiu hat, the counsels of the ancestors. So Ptah-hotep is trying to reach back in the past, okay? Trying to understand the best of the past and to bring that forward to give his son a present lesson on how to live his life. It's the same thing that Ta-Nehesi Coates is attempting to do in this text. And so this is very powerful. When you say ancestors in ancient Egypt, Imu Hat, those who are in front, that's a very powerful concept because it explains so much about African culture. Because ancestors, for them, are considered those entities that lie in front of you, not behind you, as we typically think of them. So they don't consider themselves as moving away from their ancestors. They consider themselves as moving toward them and as guiding them. And when you consider your ancestors in front, that's the thing that explains why African people all over the world, why they revere ancestors so much, why they conceive them as living entities, why they provide sacrifices, offerings, do libations, all types of rituals, because they consider them as living thing, a living entity. They're not dead. So Ta-Nehesi Coates, in order to understand this past, is involved in deep study, the same type of deep study that you all need to be involved in to understand the complexity of the world and you. He says he spent many of his days in Moreland, Spingarn, taking 3 slips out, give me these books, reading them, give me some more, reading them. He spent time on the lovely yard of Howard University, looking at the array and diversity of the black world on this campus and making his own observations and just being enthralled and enchanted by the vibrancy that you find on Howard University's campus. He speaks glowingly about that in this text. And then the other thing is that as a journalist, he asks people. You have to ask people questions. You have to ask elders questions. You have to ask people who know things. And so this is part of a method, an approach to gaining knowledge. And so this becomes very important. So these are not the ideas that Ta-Nehisi Coates espouses in this text emanate from a very deep study. And so how we explain dismemberment is important. And this intellectual figure right here, this great Kenyan scholar, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, wrote a book called Something Torn Anew, Toward an African Renaissance. And Ngugi wa Thiong'o in this book tries to explain how the dismemberment of the black body, how that dismemberment looks different on the continent versus what happens in the diaspora. Okay? So he says that the problem of language and memory presents itself differently for the continent and the diaspora. For the continent, he says the key question is, did the death intended for one's means of memory actually materialize? Say more about that in a minute. And then for the diaspora, how do you raise buried memory from the grave when the means of raising it are themselves buried in the grave or suffocated to the level of whispering ghosts? This dismemberment, of course, on the African continent begins with the slave trade, but it culminates in the late 19th century with the Berlin Conference in 1884 and 1885, the conference that carves up the African continent among various European powers. And then from that point on, then there are various colonial models of attempting to extract resources to exploit African labor and then to control those polities on the African continent. So the continent itself has had to deal with the dismemberment of that moment and how that moment impacted them. And so how Thiong'o approaches this is with a concept that he calls Lingua Pham. And Lingua Pham, when you think of Lingua Pham, think of famine, okay? Think of the word famine. And think of the idea of these colonial European powers. Their idea is to, along with that model of rule, is to starve, to marginalize, and to systematically disrespect the indigenous African cultures. And how you do that is how the methods that they used to do that were primarily through religion and then the educational process. So in terms of what was condemned in that colonial model, you have religion, drumming, dance, dress, names, rites of passage, the customs related to birth, the pouring of libation. All of those things begin to be marginalized in the educational process and suppressed. Although those things, you can see them there on the landscape, still vibrant outside of those European institutions of control. And so there are thinkers, when you read Ta-Nehisi Coates's texts, and then you understand who Ta-Nehisi Coates's father was. Paul Coates, his father, was reading texts like Cheikh Anta Diop's African Origin of Civilization in order to give his son that name of Ta-Nehisi. Okay? This is who his father was reading. And when you look at these types of pivotal figures, they have a lot to say about the dismemberment of the African continent. And so Cheikh Anta Diop is one of the most prominent and pivotal intellectual figures that you have to understand before you leave Howard University. He wrote a very important text in French in 1954 called Nation Négrière et Culture, and then it's translated into English 20 years later by actually a scholar from Howard University named Mercer Cook in the African Origin of Civilization. Okay. But Cheikh Anta Diop's Sebaït, his instruction deals with three major things that we can talk about. The first thing, the Cheikh Anta Diop felt that there was an ideological rupture that was needed with the West. And what he meant by this ideological rupture was that simply that science itself was now an accomplice to white supremacy. Okay. And that essentially means that knowledge production was linked to bolstering a white supremacist social, political, religious, and economic order. And the goal of that ideology is to make African people believe that they have produced nothing in the world of value. And an ancillary part of that is that when you frame them as producing nothing of value, then, of course, they will believe in their own subordination. They will, in fact, advocate for their own oppression on many different levels. And most importantly, they will not have any aspiration, any true aspiration for intellectual and political independence. And so Cheikh Anta Diop felt that that African people had to rupture that ideology. But when you rupture from that dismemberment, then you have to build something, right? It can't just be an act of deconstruction. You have to build something in its place. And what will you build on? And so the other thing that Cheikh Anta Diop is saying is that along with an ideological rupture is that there needs to be an epistemological rupture. And that gets to the ways of knowing and using African knowledge, using African culture, combating what he called the modern falsification of African history, but using indigenous African culture as the fuel to guide modern African development. And in order to do that, you needed new methods. But in addition to that, he felt that African people needed to know their place in the world from antiquity all the way to the present. So he felt that you can't accomplish either of those things without having a sense of historical consciousness. And so Cheikh Anta Diop is highlighted and elevated in the pantheon of African thinkers because his training was so vast. After spending time in Senegal in his early years among the Moori Brotherhood, terms of Islamic schooling. He makes his way to Paris at the Sorbonne, and there he takes a number of advanced degrees in the hard sciences, in chemistry, and also in an array of humanities and social sciences. Advanced degrees in sociology, in philosophy, in linguistics, in Egyptology, all of these different areas. And he's trying to combine. So when he goes back to Senegal, he forms the first radiocarbon dating laboratory in Senegal on the African continent. And he's trying to combine all of these different fields, these different disciplines, to bring to bear on a new conception of African history. And what he does and his work is very powerful. But he says that Western knowledge, as it looked at African people in terms of dismemberment now, that Western knowledge, what he called these Africanists, looked at African people as just isolated, independent tribes with no connection at all. And so his goal is to look at all of African culture and to describe broadly similarities and differences. But he has the idea that there are similarities that ripple throughout in time and space. And he cites in his work evidence and examples of these in social organization, in language, in various customs like circumcision, in cosmogony and how you see the world, in matriarchy, the role of women in the society. All of these cultural meanings, symbols, and things he is evidencing in this text in a very elaborate way. And he's talking about the relationship of ancient Egypt to the cultures to the south, once again in the Sudan. But this is for a particular purpose. And the particular purpose of Cheikh Anta Diop's conception is to have this knowledge be the foundation for a different type of modern Africa, to combat this dismemberment. So in charting this, this was going to lay the foundation for not only the independence of Africa, but the creation of continental and federal African states. And then also attempting to elevate African languages to support this whole process. And why elevating African languages? Because under the Western colonial model, they felt and taught that no African language had the intrinsic capacity to convey modern, difficult, complex thought in any area of human knowledge. That the only way that you can convey the complexity in these disciplines was through using a European language. And so Cheikh Anta Diop is railing against that idea. Just the belief in that idea reinforces a sense of your own inferiority. So Cheikh Anta Diop is not the only work that you find in here. There are actually many texts that Ta-Nehisi Coates makes mention of that he read that influenced him clearly from his father. But this text right here by Chancellor Williams, the Destruction of Black Civilization, Ta-Nehisi Coates says that he was walking around Howard University with Chancellor Williams functioning like his Bible. This was his Bible. This was his go-to book for everything. Why? Chancellor Williams taught at Howard University. Chancellor Williams' mentor was William Leo Hansberry, taught at Howard University. Okay? All of these links. And so Chancellor Williams makes this great study. It wasn't the book that he wanted to write, but Chancellor Williams, very sophisticated study, studied over 105 language groups, visited 24 nations all across the African continent, did extensive field work, and then he comes to this realization. So he's studying, like Cheikh Anta Diop, he's looking at the broad similarities in terms of systems of African governance that he finds, just like Cheikh Anta Diop. But also, he's saying that throughout time that African people on the continent have been their own worst enemies in a lot of sophisticated ways. So this is a very interesting text on numerous levels, but the line and the evidence of this that really resonates, and you can hear echoes in Ta-Nehisi's book, was what he calls this metaphor of view from the bridge. And a view from the bridge, once again, in terms of this Sebaid, he is trying to make a link between the past and present. So he's saying, after I've done all of this study on African civilizations, now my view from the bridge is this conclusion. Okay? Very sophisticated, and this is what African people need to do. So he has a whole plan at the end of what African people need to do to get out of this mess. So he says, what then is this view? The outlook is grim. For the black people of the world, there is no bright tomorrow. The blacks may continue to live in their dream world of singing, dancing, marching, praying, and hoping because of the deluding signs of what looks like victories, still trusting in the ultimate justice of the white man, but 1,000 years hence, their descendants will be substantially where the race was 1,000 years before. For the white people, still masters of the world, do not have to yield. They have never changed their real attitude toward black people during all the passing centuries, and there is absolutely nothing upon which to base the belief that they will change in the centuries to come. If you listen to Ta-Nehisi Coates well, you will hear echoes of Chancellor Williams. Because Ta-Nehisi Coates wants you to understand brutal truths that lie at the core of what the American project is. Those brutal truths that are difficult to say, are difficult to speak, are difficult for people to talk about, but are nevertheless there, always there, riding under the surface of the discussion of all of these issues. And Ta-Nehisi Coates is trying to get us to see that. So, how we explain the dismemberment of the African diaspora and the forcible removal of Africans from West Africa, West Central Africa, to all points of the diaspora is a little bit different. So Ngugi wa Thiong'o in his text provides a concept called linguicide. Not fam, don't think famine, don't think starvation, but think the attempt to actually kill out something, okay? The attempt to kill it. So what happens in the diaspora is an attempt to completely sever it. And Africans are railing against that, but the ruptures are more substantial than what takes place on the African continent. So Ta-Nehisi Coates says in his book, as for now, it must be said that the process of washing the disparate tribes white, the elevation of the belief in being white, was not achieved through wine tasting and ice cream socials, but rather through the pillaging of life, liberty, labor, and land, through the flaying of backs, the chaining of limbs, the strangling of dissidents, the destruction of families, the rape of mothers, the sale of children, and various other acts meant first and foremost to deny you and me the right to secure and govern our own bodies. His idea of dismemberment. And Ta-Nehisi Coates says that while he was a student at Howard University, he was reading all these stuff. There were all these different interpretations of how do you explain it. And so he says that things I believed merely a week earlier, ideas I had taken from one book, could be smashed to splinters by another. Had we retained any of our African inheritance, Fraser, E. Franklin Fraser, who taught at Howard University, says it was all destroyed. And this destruction evidences the terribleness of our capturers. Melville Herskovitz, who taught at Howard University, but for the most part taught at Northwestern, says it lives on. And this evidences the resilience of our spirit. So he's dealing with this debate, trying to understand how to explain this, but how you explain this is important. I want you all to think, like your homework, okay? I want you to think about these narratives in this way. How do you define what an African American is? Let's just use that as an example. If you define yourself as African American, what do you mean by that? And what I want to give you is that these are three ways, historical narratives, these are three ways that interpret that. So if you have a historical narrative of loss and emptiness, that means that when you frame African Americans, you are saying that, okay, Africa may be where we're ultimately from in terms of origin, but we have no traces of Africa with us now. We have been completely cut off from that. We've lost everything. We've lost our language. We've lost our culture. We've lost our history. We lost our customs, our traditions. So all that we have in America is race. So essentially, African Americans are framed as black-skinned white people, okay, in this frame, because the default project of humanity is whiteness in America, okay? So you're operating on a culture, okay? So this frames African Americans as having no culture of their own, but using the culture of the oppressor that's on the landscape. Number two, historical narratives of African continuity and collective synthesis and transformation interfacing with particular social conditions encounter survival, resistance, and cultural memory. That position will frame African Americans as not coming to America as empty vessels. They come to America with their own worldviews, with their own values, with their own beliefs, with their own customs. And although you're not looking for exact replications with Africa, that they carry that cultural memory and that they are able to use that foundation to continue to innovate, to create, to build, and to extend themselves on the American landscape. And the third narrative is historical narratives of newness that emphasize local cultures as hybrid and Creole, diminishing the connection with Africa. And so these Creole narratives, what they fail to do is that they fail to historicize and contextualize the African experience and the relationships between African people in the diaspora and African people on the continent. And it's not just merely a question of charting survivals or retentions. It's a question of how African people are engaging a tradition, how African people are using their cultural memory in the face of these unrelenting systems of oppression to extend their own humanity in a space. And you see the evidence of this everywhere. If we would only find new ways to study it. And so, in combating this dismemberment, your perspective on that dismemberment is critical for you framing everything else that will come after. It will frame how you fight it. It will frame how you explain it. It will explain how you interpret it. That's why those narratives are so important. And to read them in the writings of other people as you see them. But this work, Exchanging Our Country Marks, gives us an opportunity to look at kind of an improved methodology in terms of looking at this question. And this text, Exchanging Our Country Marks, is by a scholar named Michael Gomez at New York University. And it's just one example of many that I could give. But it's just one prominent example of a text that asks different types of questions. And when you ask different types of questions, looking at different types of evidence, you get different types of answers. And the questions that he is asking are, what are the worldviews, values that African people exhibit in the United States. So he's studying the African presence in the United States systematically all the way up until around 1830. And he's looking at the African continent. So he has expertise on the African continent, and then he has expertise on this side. And he is saying that what we see of Congo, what we see in Western African religion, spirituality, traditions, and history, how does that play out in the formative period in the United States on the American landscape? How can we see that on the American landscape? So he studies that systematically, and he shows very convincingly that these are African people operating on this landscape. They are not empty cultural vessels, that they are extending with creativity these traditions that they brought with them from the African continent. And so the Africanness of something new is important. And we see the Africanness of this something new everywhere. We see it in art, we see it in music, literature, dress, architecture, tools, cuisine, language, philosophy, knowledge, religion, family patterns, political culture. We see it everywhere. But if you frame Black lives, if you frame Black people as just merely black-skinned white people, you won't get these answers because you're asking the wrong question. And so if your conversation in the dismemberment, if your conversation revolves around the question of race purely, you won't get these answers because you're asking the wrong questions. Because the right question is, how do you explain African humanity, African people to themselves, not how do you explain Black people to white people? That's a different conversation. So there are two conversations that you have to keep out here. There is the race conversation that we have to deal with in the United States, and then there is our humanity. And that's a much broader conversation than race. That gets to our culture of who we are as a people, what are our values, and how we have extended those in time and space. And despite the resilience of African culture in the United States and all throughout the diaspora, Ta-Nehisi Coates, his advice for all of us is to continue to struggle. That the struggle, despite this resilience of African people, our struggle has not ended. But if Black lives matter to you, you owe it to yourself and to your ancestors, those who are in front. You owe it to those ancestors to systematically learn and investigate who your people were and are in the world, and to use that information and knowledge to inform your life, to inform your decisions. And if Black lives matter to you, you will continue to struggle for justice for your ancestors, for justice in this world, and you will name your own reality as you live in this world, and to make people hear you because you believe in your own humanity on the deepest level, and that you love the people that you claim to speak for. You can't serve a people that you don't love. And so when Black Lives Matter, you all have to understand that if you don't prepare yourselves in your studies to gather all of the information that you can in this space, that you will be doing a great disservice to your communities and to your ancestors. So I hope that in your studies, you will take this knowledge, you will extend it, and you will do your best work to uphold this great tradition that African people have produced, not only on the continent, but all over the African diaspora. Thank you very much.